In this video, you will hear a story that no one has dared to tell before, a story that began quietly in a small village, and ended with screams that the night will never forget. Everything you will hear now is true as it was narrated, and the events are not for the faint of heart. Turn off the lights, and put on your earphones, because you are about to enter a world from which there is no return. My name is Andrew, and I'm 17 years old. I live with my family in a small village, far from the cities, isolated from the world like a thread forgotten on the edges of a map. The roads leading to it are narrow and broken. Cars rarely pass through them, and strangers never visit. We are 7 people under one roof, in an old house built of stone and mud. The walls ooze damp, and the roof makes a faint groan with every gust of wind, as if breathing in silence. When night falls, the place is plunged into a deep silence, broken only by the whistle of the wind coming from the nearby forest. My father is a silent man, the harshness of life etched in his features. He spends his days in the forest, chopping firewood and returning before sunset, carrying the fatigue and silence of the day on his shoulders. As for my mother, she is a quiet, pale-faced, kind-hearted woman who moves around the house like a guardian spirit. She prepares food, cleans, whispers prayers, and holds my younger siblings close to her on windy nights. As for my older brother, Arthur, he's different. He's 19 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and quieter than usual. His gaze wanders, as if he's always listening to something we can't. Nevertheless, he's beloved among us. We take refuge in his presence, and we cling to the stories he tells every evening. He knew how to tell scary tales, how to make us listen with bated breath, and how to end the story with a mysterious smile. I'm Andrew. There are 3 little girls among us, Leah, Nadine, and Salma. They were the angels of this house. The sounds of their laughter filled the space, lightening its weight and bringing it a bit of life. But in recent months, that laughter has faded, as if something unknown has been creeping toward us, without us recognizing its shape or voice. We live a simple life. There's no electricity, no modern appliances, only wood stoves and candlelight. We gather after dinner in the living room, huddled around Arthur as he narrated, listening in silence, sometimes laughing. But something inside me was uneasy. There was an emptiness, an invisible weight pressing on my chest, especially when I turned around to see Arthur staring out the window, unnoticed. As for the village, its inhabitants are few and far between, mostly elderly, silent, not talking much, and closing their doors with sunset. The only shop in the village opens once a week, the school closed 5 years ago, and the mosque only calls the prayer on holidays. But what's truly disturbing is the forest. It surrounds us on all sides, its trees dense and black, preventing light from passing through. It seems like a living wall separating us from the rest of the world. We were forbidden to approach it after the afternoon, and the adults whispered strange things about it. But Arthur and I would sometimes sneak in, gather firewood, and hurry back without exchanging a word. Once, as we were walking among the trees, Arthur stopped suddenly. He looked somewhere in the darkness, then whispered, "Did you hear that?" I heard nothing, except my heart pounding. I ignored his question, but he remained silent the rest of the way, his eyes never leaving that dark corner among the trees. This is my life. A small family in a dying village, between an exhausted father, a silent mother, and an older brother. He began to change little by little. I could sense something approaching, something nameless. I didn't know then that the coming days would bring us nightmares from which we would never wake. That morning, the sky was overcast, and the air was unusually cold. We woke up early, as usual. Father had pointed to a large tree at the edge of the forest that needed to be cut down before the autumn storms approached. Arthur, as usual, didn't hesitate. He grabbed his wooden axe and put it over his shoulder, then turned to me and said, "Come on, Andrew, come with me. We'll finish this quickly." I hesitated a little. That particular tree. I'd been afraid of it ever since I was a child. Perhaps because it was different from the others, taller, darker, and its roots curled like human fingers sprouting from the ground. But I didn't want to appear cowardly in front of it, so I silently followed its steps, and together we walked toward the forest. The closer we got to the tree, the heavier the air felt, and everything around us seemed to be watching us. Not a bird chirped, not a leaf stirred, just rock-hard silence. We had arrived. I stood watching it from a distance, while Arthur began to circle around it, examining it with his eyes. He said to me, "I'll go up a little and cut some branches from above. It'll be easier." I shouted at him, "Arthur, no. Leave it to Dad. This tree isn't natural, haven't you noticed?" But he didn't answer. He just smiled that short smile that meant, "You don't understand." Then he began to climb the tree as if he were doing it for the 1000th time. I watched him, my heart pounding, my mind repeating, "Something's wrong. Something's wrong." He reached about halfway up the tree and stood on one of the thick branches. He took out the axe and tried to strike. But he didn't strike. He stood there, frozen, as if listening to something, or seeing something I couldn't see. Suddenly, without a sound, and without the branch moving beneath him, he fell. He didn't stumble. He didn't slip. Rather, it was as if he had been pushed. It was as if something invisible had pushed him forcefully from behind. I saw his body quickly fall among the branches, then hit the ground with a muffled thud, followed by a faint echo that echoed through the trees. I shouted, "Arthur!" I ran toward him, my legs trembling, my chest heaving with fear. He was lying on his side, his eyes closed, his face pale, his mouth half open. I shouted his name, shook him, but he didn't answer. I almost cried. I couldn't bear the sight. I felt something inside me shatter, something hidden and mysterious, as if the fall wasn't just physical, but a part of his soul had vanished with it. I ran with all my might back home. I couldn't feel my feet, I couldn't hear anything, except the pounding of my heart and the name Arthur I was shouting through the trees. I arrived home panting, my face wet with tears, my voice hoarse, "Mom! Dad! Arthur, he fell. In the forest. Come quickly." My father rushed after me without a word. My mother, however, understood more from my expression than from my words. We returned to the tree. But Arthur was not there. My father and I ran toward the spot where Arthur had fallen. But he wasn't there. I looked at the ground, where his body should have been. I looked in every direction. He should have been there. I saw him fall with my own eyes, heard the thud, smelled the dust that flew up as he fell. Then my father called in a deep voice, "Andrew, come." I walked closer with heavy footsteps. My father was standing behind the tree. And there, I saw him. Arthur, lying on his side, as if he were sleeping soundly. His face was clean, free of blood or bruises, as if he had never fallen. But what really terrified me was that the spot where he'd found him wasn't where he'd fallen. My father knelt beside him, put his hand to his chest. Breathing, thank God. As for me, I just stared at his face, frozen. Something wasn't right. His eyes were closed, but his features looked different. I hesitated, then whispered, "Father, are you sure it's Arthur?" He turned to me, his eyes narrowing in surprise. "What are you saying? Of course he's your brother. Are you crazy?" I wanted to explain that I was certain Arthur had fallen on the other side of the tree. I wanted to say that what happened wasn't normal. But something made me shut up. We returned home. My father was carrying Arthur on his back, and I was walking behind him. With a cold face. With my steps steady. With my heart not beating as it had before. as if I'd lost something of myself under that tree, and left it there. At home, my mother greeted us with terror, then when she saw Arthur, her fear turned to joy. She cried out his name and bent down to kiss his forehead. Thank God, thank God. Even my father, despite his apparent cruelty, breathed a sigh of relief. He sat on the wooden chair, wiped his face with his palm, and said, "We survived." As for me, I remained standing by the door of the room, staring at my brother lying on the bed. Then suddenly, Arthur opened his eyes. He slowly got up, as if something heavy was holding him down. He looked around as if he didn't know where he was. Then he looked at my mother and smiled. But his smile wasn't his smile. There was something missing in it, something strange, unfamiliar. It was like an attempt to imitate a face he once had. My mother hugged him, and my father smiled for the first time in months. As for me, I didn't move. I watched him silently. Every movement, every blink, every breath. The one in front of me wasn't my brother. After dinner, everyone sat around Arthur, asking him how he felt, what he felt, and if he remembered anything. He answered quietly, his voice normal, his laugh normal. But I saw that he was talking a lot. The real Arthur didn't talk like that. Something deep inside me whispered to me, "Watch his eyes, just his eyes." And as they talked, I walked quietly out the back door, back into the woods, to that tree. I stood beneath it and looked up. The wind was moving through the branches, and the earth was as silent as it had been in the morning. But I felt that something was still there, waiting for me. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept reliving the image of Arthur opening his eyes the morning before, and the strange smile he'd worn on his face. I could hear it in my head, see it in the darkness of the room. Night fell, and the house was quiet. The wind howled outside, and the sounds of branches scraping against the windows. I was sitting on my bed, staring at the half-open door, not knowing why I had a feeling that something was wrong. Then, I saw him. Through the crack in the window, in the garden, Arthur was standing. Standing motionless, staring into the darkness ahead. He wasn't turning around, he wasn't blinking, just as still as a tree trunk. I stared at him for a few seconds, trying to convince myself that he was meditating, or perhaps thinking. But his body was unnaturally rigid. He stood there until I felt goosebumps creeping up my spine. I wanted to call out to him, but my voice was gone. I bent down to close the window, and when I looked up, he wasn't there. The next day, I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. When evening came, the house was plunged into a heavy silence. My mother was asleep, my father was in his room, and my little sisters were fast asleep. I went out of my room to get a drink of water. And as I passed the living room, I stopped. There, in the dark corner of the room, Arthur was standing. I didn't hear his footsteps, I didn't feel him enter. His back was against the wall, his head lowered forward, moving slowly. Right, left, right, left. A steady, continuous movement, as if his neck were detached from his body. I took a step closer, then I heard something. Whispers. Scattered words, not belonging to any language I knew. But they were cold, sticky, as if they were flowing from somewhere far away. Sure, M-R-L-A. I could hear and feel it in my bones, not in my ears. I tried to summon up the courage to say, "Arthur." The whispers stopped abruptly. But his head kept moving, right, left. Then, ever so slowly, he began to raise his head. Until his eyes met mine. His eyes weren't as I remembered. There was no life in them, not even a human blackness. It was a blank, cold stare, like a stagnant pool of water on a moonlit night. I froze, unable to move. Then he smiled, a smile I'd never seen on anyone before. At that moment, the wind blew out the living room lamp, and we were plunged into darkness. Hours passed since that night, but the image of it never left my mind. That whisper, those empty eyes, and that unforgettable smile. The next day, I tried to avoid Arthur as much as possible. But he seemed to be searching for me, watching me from afar, as if he knew I was suspicious of him. Sometimes I saw him standing at the end of the corridor, or behind a slightly ajar door, staring silently, unblinking. Night fell, and with it, anxiety returned. The house was immersed in silence, except for the sounds of the wind passing through the trees and the ticking of the clock in the living room. I was in my bed, trying to sleep, when I heard something. Footsteps. They weren't ordinary footsteps. They were slow, heavy, as if the person was dragging their feet on the floor. I stopped at my bedroom door, then I heard a low hum. I didn't dare move, my whole body tensed. Moments later, the footsteps began to recede, heading toward the living room. I felt a strange desire to know what was going on, despite the fear that gripped my heart. I slowly got up, left my room, and walked down the dark corridor. When I reached the living room door, I froze. Arthur was standing in the center of the room, but he wasn't alone. On the wall behind him, there was a shadow moving. A long, twisting shadow, writhing as if made of black smoke, but it wasn't the shadow of his body. It moved independently, approaching the ceiling, then shrinking in on itself, then expanding again. Arthur, however, was whispering faster this time, in a language I didn't understand, as if he were talking to the shadow. I felt a harsh chill sweep through the room, and my breathing became heavy. Suddenly, Arthur stopped whispering and slowly turned his head toward me. But the shadow didn't stop. It kept moving behind him, as if it hadn't noticed me. Arthur smiled so widely that his mouth seemed too big. "He's awake," he said in a low voice. And then, all the lights in the house went out at once. I was plunged into complete darkness, and I could see nothing, except the movement of that shadow, as it approached. I swear I didn't sleep that night. I was lying on my bed, listening to the wind outside, trying to forget that shadow. But the whispers were still ringing in my ears, as if they were part of my thoughts now. At dawn, I heard movement in the house. I got up and found my father and mother in the kitchen, talking about something ordinary, some wet firewood that needed to be dried. But Arthur wasn't there. I asked about him, and my father said he must have left early in the morning. I didn't comment, but I knew Arthur hadn't left the house. I could feel it. The day dragged on, and every time I passed Arthur's room, I heard something, a faint rustle, as if something was crawling on the floor. One time, I put my ear to the door and heard heavy breathing, then a short, muffled laugh, as if directed at me. I turned away immediately, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. As night fell, the house was plunged into darkness. Everyone had gone to bed early because of the power outage, and I was left pacing between my room and the hallway. Then, as I passed the living room, I heard the door suddenly close behind me. I turned around, and Arthur was standing by the door, looking at me with an expressionless face. He said in a very quiet voice, "Andrew, do you know what darkness looks like when it swallows a person?" I didn't wait for a reply, so I moved toward the hallway, but the door leading to it was locked. I turned toward the other door, also locked. I felt the room shrink, and Arthur was advancing toward me with slow but steady steps. He began whispering again, and this time the whispers were loud, as if they were coming from every corner of the room, not just his mouth. I was searching for something to defend myself with, but my hands were trembling. Then, I felt a chill wrap around my feet, as if something slimy was crawling out of the ground. I looked down. I saw thin, black threads, moving like worms, coming towards me from all directions. I jumped back, and Arthur smiled as if enjoying the scene. I said to him, "Arthur, what did they do to you?" I paused, then tilted his head. "They didn't do it to me, they sent me back." My whole body trembled. Sent him back? Who were they? And from where? But there was no time to think, because the black threads wrapped tightly around my legs, and a chill pierced my bones. I screamed, throwing my body backward until I hit the wall. In an instant, all the doors opened at once. But the room was empty. No Arthur, no threads, no shadow. I stood panting, trying to process what had happened, before I heard his voice behind me, very close to my ear. "It's your turn, Andrew." I turned quickly, but there was no one there. And the house was as silent as a grave. I no longer knew when night began, or when day ended. From that moment in the living room, everything in the village seemed to tilt, as if the world had lost its balance. The air felt heavier, and the house groaned in the night as if it were breathing. The next day, I resolved to keep an eye on Arthur, no matter what. I knew there was something moving in the shadows around him, and that something was getting stronger. I followed him as he went out into the field behind the house. He walked slowly, his eyes not looking ahead, but up at the gray sky. He stopped at the edge of the woods, then suddenly turned toward me, with the sharpest smile I'd ever seen. He said, "I knew you'd come." Without warning, he ran into the woods, as if something was pulling him. I hesitated a moment, then I caught up with him. The trees were tangled, and the darkness inside was much deeper than outside, even though the sun hadn't set yet. I could hear his voice, but not from just one direction, it came from everywhere. "Andrew, remember when we were little? Remember the night you cried, and no one was in the room but me, and him?" I stopped, my heart pounding. But him? Who did he mean? I kept walking until I finally saw him, standing beside a huge tree, much taller than he should have been. He wasn't moving, but he was whispering, and I saw those black threads emerging from the trunk of the tree itself, coiling around his arms like snakes. I took a step closer, but the ground beneath my feet suddenly opened. It wasn't an ordinary hole, but a black mouth, breathing, sending out air as cold as death. I backed away quickly, but Arthur turned toward me, his eyes completely dark, with no white in them. He smiled and said in a double voice, as if two people were speaking together, "You're next. He wants you." Before I could move, he leaped toward me with inhuman speed. We fell to the ground, his hands gripping my neck tightly, but his hand wasn't as warm as I remembered. It was cold, hard, as if it were made of stone. I was suffocating, and the shadow behind him grew larger, stretching across the ground and the trunks around us, as if it wanted to swallow me. I screamed with all my might, grabbed a stone, and hit him on the head. He recoiled, but the blood that flowed wasn't red, it was black, thick, and smelled of rot. I stood gasping, taking a step back, but he slowly got up, a smile still on his face. He said, "Your strike won't get me out, but he's close now, very close." Then suddenly, the forest began to emit strange sounds, whispers among the trees, heavy footsteps, and the creaking of branches as if something enormous was moving toward us. I looked around, and saw among the shadows a tall figure, its limbs disproportionate to its body, its face featureless, except for an open mouth, too open. I shuddered, it was him. The thing that brought Arthur back. I no longer thought. I ran with all my might toward the house, feeling their footsteps behind me, Arthur's footsteps, and the footsteps of the entity, and the sound of their breathing mingling with the cold air. The closer I got to the edge, the more I felt the night thicken, as if the forest wouldn't let me out. I leaped between the trees until I finally saw the lights of the house in the distance, but when I turned back, I saw nothing. Not Arthur, not the entity. I stood, breathing heavily, knowing that this wasn't an escape, but the beginning of the Rayal chase. I ran until I felt my lungs burning, and when I reached the door, I pushed it open with all my might and closed it behind me. I leaned my back against it, catching my breath, trying to convince myself I'd survived. But the silence that filled the house was unnatural. I didn't hear the laughter of my younger siblings, or my mother's footsteps in the kitchen, or even my father's voice reading the newspaper. The house was empty. I walked cautiously toward the hallway, calling out, "Mom? Dad?" No answer. A cold sweat began to drip from my forehead, and I heard something faint, a slow, repetitive knocking sound coming from upstairs. It wasn't like knocking on a door, it was like knocking on wood, from inside. I crept up the stairs, the knocking sound becoming more distinct. Each step creaked beneath my feet, as if the house itself hated my movement. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. The knocking was coming from Arthur's room. Gathering my courage, I reached for the doorknob. But before I could touch it, the sound suddenly stopped. A silence heavier than stone fell, and I could even hear my own heartbeat. And then came the whisper. A whisper very close, just beyond the door. "Andrew, open up. I want to show you something." I didn't open it. I took a step back, but the door opened of its own accord, very slowly, and the darkness inside seemed alive. I saw a tall shadow standing in the corner, eyes glowing like embers. It was Arthur, or what was left of him. He smiled and said, "He came with us." Then, from behind him, the figure I'd seen in the woods emerged. He was bigger now, his limbs longer, and his voice like 1,000 whispers tangled together. He crawled across the wall and ceiling as if gravity didn't matter to him, and his limbs stopped at the edge of the door, as if he couldn't get out, yet. Arthur closed his eyes and began to whisper rapid words, and with each word, the walls of the room shook, and the family portraits on the walls began to move. Their faces in the photographs changed. They all smiled the same way Arthur did, even my mother and father. The color drained from the photographs, and their faces became as pale as the dead. I quickly backed down the stairs, but before I could reach them, I found my father standing at the end. I felt a sudden relief, until I looked up to see. His eyes were completely black, just like Arthur's. He smiled and held out his hand towards me. "Don't run away, Andrew, we've chosen you." I ran towards the front door, but when I opened it, I didn't see the fields or the village. There was the same forest, dark, the trees moving slowly as if they were breathing. Out of the shadows, I saw dozens of red eyes gleaming. I quickly closed the door and leaned against it, panting. But suddenly, I felt a chill on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned and saw Arthur standing a step away, the thing behind him filling half the path. He came closer and whispered in my ear, "Tonight, you won't go out, and the night won't end." At that moment, all the lights went out. All that remained was the sound of their breathing around me, so close. I could feel it touching my face. I no longer knew how much time had passed in that darkness. My breathing was quickening, my heart pounding in my chest, as I tried to feel my way along the wall. But with every step I took, there was another sound, the sound of feet following me, but not touching the ground as I did, but gliding over it like a shadow. I heard Arthur's voice approaching from behind, whispering my name slowly. "Andrew." I didn't reply, but instead rushed toward the kitchen. I knew there was a window overlooking the back garden. But when I arrived and opened the curtains, I didn't see the garden. There were long wooden hallways, stretching endlessly, and the walls were adorned with old photographs of our family, but their faces were distorted, stretched, as if someone had tried to tear them apart and then sew them back together. I heard a rustle behind me, and turned. Arthur was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, but he didn't move. Instead, that twisted shadow emerged from beside him, creeping across the floor and ceiling, approaching the window I wanted to exit through, and then, it closed itself, as if the glass had melted and completely blocked the opening. I felt as if the house itself was closing in on me. I rushed toward the corridor leading to the front door, but the closer I got, the further it got. The corridor grew longer, its dim lights gradually fading. I ran until I felt I'd never make it, and suddenly, I found myself in front of the door. I opened it immediately. But instead of seeing the village or the forest, I found myself in my bedroom. The same bed, the same closet, but something was different. On the bed, there was me, asleep. I approached slowly, watching that body that looked just like me, until I noticed that its chest wasn't rising, it wasn't breathing. I reached out to touch it, but suddenly, it grabbed my wrist so tightly that I screamed. He opened his eyes, and I found them completely black. Then he smiled and said in my own voice, "You were the dream, and I am the reality." He pulled me forcefully toward the bed, and I felt the ground beneath my feet no longer exist. I began to fall into a dark void, many voices whispering incomprehensible words in my ear, until I hit the cold wooden floor. I raised my head. I was downstairs again, but the house was strange. The walls were breathing slowly, and the ceiling was dripping with an ink-black liquid. In the corner, my mother was standing, but she didn't turn to me. I stepped toward her, reaching out my hand, but before I could touch her shoulder, she turned quickly, her face featureless. She opened her mouth, and out came the same whisper Arthur was repeating. Suddenly, all the pictures fell from the walls, and all the windows and doors closed with a thud. The lights went out again, leaving only a ray of light coming from the living room. I approached, and when I arrived, I found Arthur sitting on a chair, smiling, with a single candle lit in front of him. He said quietly, "Tonight we will finish what we started, but not here." Then he blew out the candle, and everything returned to darkness. But at that moment, I felt many hands grabbing me from behind, pulling me into a cold, damp place, while his laughter echoed throughout the house. I woke up to a deep chill penetrating my bones, as if the entire atmosphere had turned into endless, frozen snow. I didn't remember sleeping at all, and the floor I lay on was damp and cold until I cautiously touched it. I opened my eyes very slowly, but what I saw was a living nightmare. I was in a narrow corridor, its walls made of rotting wood, dripping with a thick black liquid, making distinct sounds like the croaking of frogs in a stagnant pond. Light barely filtered into the corridor, and whenever I moved, darkness crept toward me like a living, breathing creature. I tried to stand up, but my limbs were bound with an unbearable weight, as if invisible threads were holding me to the ground. I looked down at my feet. I saw only darkness, but not ordinary darkness. It was moving and writhing delicately and dangerously, like a slippery creature trying to swallow me. I began to hear whispers, not far away, but inside my head, from all sides. There were many voices, some familiar, some frightening, intermingling as if they were tearing my mind apart. Amidst the din, one voice stood out clearly, as soft as my mother's whisper, but tinged with deep sadness. "Go home, this is not your place." I turned behind me and saw a blurry figure that looked like my mother, but distorted indescribably. She was standing at the end of the corridor, but her body was stretched out unnaturally, her shoulders slumped as if a terrible weight were weighing her down. She was smiling so broadly that her mouth was slit from ear to ear, but no words came out. I didn't move, I felt my body freeze, and as she advanced, she moved toward me with slow steps, as if emerging from deeper darkness. With each step, she creaked loudly, as if would groaning in pain. The sound of the whispers grew louder until it filled my ears. I stepped back, until I bumped into a cold wooden wall. There was an old, locked door, marked with strange engravings and broken glass shards. I pushed hard, and it slowly opened, revealing a small, dark room. Inside, there was nothing but a huge mirror covered in a thick layer of black dust. I approached cautiously, wiping the dust away with my trembling hand to see what lay beyond. In the mirror, I didn't see my reflection. Instead, there was Arthur, standing directly behind me, smiling a terrifying smile. When I turned around, there was no one there. I looked again in the mirror, and Arthur's face filled the frame, his eyes as black as night, his smile barely leaving his lips. Then he began to speak, but his voice came from my own mouth. He whispered, "Andrew, you weren't here before. We brought you." Suddenly, all the lights in the room went out, and I was plunged into darkness. But this darkness wasn't still, it was breathing slowly. I could hear his breathing, and feel a cool breeze caressing my face and neck. Then I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, gradually pressing down until my fingers felt numb. The dim light returned, but the room felt smaller, the walls narrowing, and the air feeling heavy as if I were trapped inside a tight box. The smell of mold and blood filled the air. I began to hear footsteps moving around me, long, twisting, featureless shadows dancing on the walls. They came closer until they were just a breath away. I closed my eyes, but even in the darkness I could see them clearly. Then I heard Arthur's voice whisper in my ear, "This isn't the end, we haven't even begun." The moment Arthur said, "This isn't the end, we haven't even begun," everything began to crumble inside me. I could no longer distinguish between reality and fantasy, between what was living and what was dead. I was standing in the middle of a room that was getting smaller and smaller, its walls disappearing as if enveloped in a thick, black fog. I closed my eyes, trying to find peace in the darkness, but there was no quiet. Only whispers crept deep within me. It was calling my name in a cold voice, bending between my ears as if emerging from underground. When I opened my eyes, I found myself sitting on the floor, the atmosphere around me covered in a deadly blackness, as if I were at the bottom of an endless well. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear heavy breathing approaching, swallowing the space. The whispers had become clear voices now, vague but threatening words, pulling me into depths I didn't want to reach. I felt movement behind me, so I slowly turned around to find a shadow smiling Arthurianly, his eyes dark, leaning towards me as he whispered, "Andrew, everything will soon be clear." I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out, as if the air had been ripped from my lungs. I began to slide backward, the ground beneath me moving, fading, as if I were drowning in a sea of darkness. Then, suddenly, I saw the image of my mother, father, and younger sisters, but their faces were distorted, their eyes blind, their mouths open, whispering in an eerie silence. The images leaned closer and whispered, "We're not here anymore, Andrew, we've been gone for a long time." I fell to my knees, a prickling sensation in my chest as if something was slowly piercing my heart. I screamed, but no sound came. At that moment, I felt a hand grab my shoulder, cold as ice. I turned around to find Arthur standing behind me, smiling a smile that made you feel nothing but terror. He said, "Now, you're part of this place. There's no escape, no salvation." The room began to swirl around me, everything spinning fast, voices and faces blurring into my vision, as if my mind was being torn to pieces. I no longer knew who I was, or where I was. In my last flash of consciousness, I heard my mother's voice whispering slowly, "Go home, Andrew, go back." But I couldn't. The nights continued endlessly, and each day I sank deeper into a sea of horror and darkness. I lived in a world straddling reality and nightmare, where I could no longer distinguish between them. My psyche was crumbling, and my heart groaned under the weight of memories and nightmares that haunted me relentlessly. One night, the loneliness surrounding me could no longer bear it, and I decided to confront Arthur. I knew what lay ahead would be nothing but tragedy, but I no longer feared death, I feared remaining alive in this hell. I headed to the forest where all the strange things had begun, where Arthur had lived with that dark shadow. When I arrived, the trees seemed larger than ever, and the wind howled as if it were crying. I saw Arthur standing in the center of a ring of trees, his black eyes shining in the darkness. He looked at me with a cold smile and said, his voice filled with sadness and madness, "Andrew, I'm no longer me. Nothing here is as you think." I approached him, but suddenly, a large shadow sprang from behind him, embracing him tightly. Arthur screamed, but it was a faint scream, as if his life was slowly being sucked out. I tried to break free, but the shadow was strong, and it began to wrap itself around my body. I felt everything fading around me, my breath growing weaker, and my heart beating frighteningly slowly. I saw Arthur look at me one last time, his eyes tearing, and he whispered, "Don't be afraid. In the end, we will be free." And then, he fell to the ground, cold and lifeless. The shadow suddenly broke and vanished with a terrible scream, leaving me alone in the woods. I stood there, alone, a deadly coldness enveloping my body and soul. I knew this was the end of a family torn apart by a curse that would never leave me. I returned to the house, which was now just a memory, and realized that I was left alone, amidst a deadly silence, and that I would carry this horror with me forever. This story was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever written and recorded for you. Every word, every moment, every sound, I put a lot of effort and time into. If its events touched you deeply or scared you, don't forget to support me by pressing the like button, subscribing to the channel, and activating the notification bell. By doing so, you give me the strength to continue presenting deeper and darker stories. Thank you for being part of this dark journey. We will meet in a new nightmare.